Channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Good evening. The kids from over 100 schools did not go back today because the concrete is dangerous and it may collapse on them. We'll ask tonight, who is to blame? Is it Rishi Sunak? Is it the Labour Party? Is it decisions taken way back in the 1950s? Tomorrow, the Commons debates the energy bill. We have an interview tonight with Chris Packham, environmental campaigner, some may say fanatic. He'll tell us why covering the Palace of Westminster in solar panels may just save the world. And for council taxpayers everywhere, did you know that you are funding, in many cases, lots and lots of people who are working not just from home, but actually living abroad and working for your local council? What can be done about that? But before we get to those subjects, let's get the news with Ray Addison.
Thanks, Nigel. Our top stories this hour. The Education Secretary has confirmed a list of schools affected by the concrete crisis will be published this week. It comes after Gillian Keegan was heard expressing her frustration at the situation in an unusually frank, expletive-ridden hot mic moment.
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their and done nothing? No signs of that, no?
Well, Ms Keegan has since apologised for her use of language.
Well, it wasn't me talking about anyone in particular. It was an off-the-cuff remark after the news interview had finished, or apparently after it had finished. And I'd like to apologise for my choice language. That was unnecessary. But it was an off-the-cuff remark, basically, you know, based on the interview. The interview had been pressing me quite hard, you know, why I hadn't solved this issue, which had been going on since 1994.
Well, the Prime Minister has attempted to bat away accusations regarding his role in the crisis while he was Chancellor. Rishi Sunak saying it's wrong to suggest that he is to blame for failing to fully fund a programme to rebuild England's schools when he was Chancellor.
Of course, I know the timing is frustrating, but I want to give people a sense of the scale of what we're grappling with here. There are around 22,000 schools in England, and the important thing to know is we expect that 95% of those schools won't be impacted by this. Around 50 schools have already been mitigated. Another 100 are in the process of being so. And our expectation is in a matter of weeks, the bulk of the remaining schools that will have this issue will be identified as well.
Northern Ireland's Police Chief Simon Byrne has resigned. A recent court ruling deemed Mr Byrne's disciplinary actions against 2 junior officers were unlawful. It follows a major data breach last month, which revealed the details of 10,000 PSNI staff. UK government sources have confirmed that French police have stopped more than 15,000 migrants from reaching the UK in small boats so far this year. GB News can reveal tougher French policing around some key migrant launch points has significantly disrupted people smuggling activities. The overall number of Channel migrants is more than 20% down on the same period last year. The Health Secretary has appointed Lady Justice Thirlwall to head up the inquiry into crimes committed by child serial killer Lucy Letby. Steve Barclay says the inquiry will have legal powers to compel witnesses to provide evidence. That's expected to include former and current staff of the Countess of Chester Hospital NHS Foundation Trust, where Letby worked. And Angela Rayner is the new Shadow Deputy Prime Minister and Levelling Up Secretary as Sir Keir Starmer reshuffles his top team. She replaces Lisa Nandy, who becomes Shadow Cabinet Minister for International Development. Among the other changes, Pat McFadden taking on the influential role of National Campaign Coordinator, as well as Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying, play GB News. Now let's get straight back to Nigel.
Good evening. In the wake of World War II, there was an awful lot of building to do, not just because of bomb damage, but because, of course, of a very rapidly growing post-war boomer generation. And also the fact that people wanted better houses and better public buildings. But in the case of public buildings, many were very, very badly built. Jerry-built, that was the term that was cynically used by many people at the time. And we know much, of course, now about the use of asbestos, for example, in public buildings. But now we learn about a type of concrete, a sort of concrete with bubbles in it, a bit like an Aero chocolate bar that was used in a lot of public buildings. And over the weekend, it came to light that there are about 104 schools that did not go back today. Gosh, I do pity the poor parents, particularly after six weeks of rain. And we learn it's dangerous and they could fall in, and much remedial work has got to be done. And the Labour Party have been very much on the attack, saying, isn't it monstrous that literally on the eve of the children going back, they're told those particular schools are closed? And how many more schools could there be in that category? The response from the Conservatives back towards Labour is, well, at least in England, we're having a look at schools and public buildings built with this rack concrete, whereas in Wales, Labour-run Wales, none of this work and research has been done. So when you get a row like this, who's to blame? Tell me your thoughts on that, Farage at gbnews.com. Now, into the middle of all of this is the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, who did a big media round this morning, including an interview with ITV. Now, it is always a very good object lesson. Think back, perhaps, to Gordon Brown, who walked away from an interview with a microphone still in his pocket. But even when you're off air, perhaps you're not really off air. This is what happened after the interview that Gillian Keegan gave to ITV this morning.
We will get a plan, and every single one of them will be done.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their and done nothing? No signs of that, no?
Now, it may well have been naughty of ITV to play out that clip because she didn't think she was being recorded. But hey, you're still mic'd up, the camera's rolling, and from a journalistic point of view, I guess you're fair game. But what it revealed was just the most astonishing level of self-regard that Gillian Keegan has for herself. Indeed, so many inside the Westminster bubble do. Talk about don't get it. Talk about detached. It was all about her. I'm doing a fantastic job, and why aren't you praising me? Yet another over-promoted politician. Now, I wonder how many of you watching this programme had even heard of RAAC Concrete before this weekend? I'm going to bet you hardly any of you had. So let's try and find out, to begin with, what it actually is. And Warren Thomas, who is a concrete expert at Henderson Thomas Associates. Warren, assume with me and the audience, assume a knowledge level hovering at around about 0. So please tell us what this building material is and what the risks are.
Yes, Nigel, it was a lightweight concrete, really concrete is stretching the point there, that was used ostensibly after the war through to about the mid-80s. Being lightweight and quite cheap to manufacture, it was used ostensibly in single-storey schools and other buildings. The issue is that it was flagged up that there were some issues with it because it's very lightweight. It has, as you said, looks like a chocolate bar that we all well know. And because of that, if it's not maintained properly, it can have major issues with its stability. Now, the first indications of this were produced in a report by the Building Research Establishment as early as 1996.
Good Lord.
So that's when it was first on the radar. Subsequent to that, we then have heard about the school that fell down in Kent in 2018. After that had happened, a number of good organisations, including the Institute of Structural Engineers, who are the experts, decided to produce a guidance note, which we've been following in the sector very closely. From what I can gather with respect to the schools and what's happened, a questionnaire went out last year sometime to the schools to say, hey guys, have you got rack concrete? Not very helpful, as I would have said. And then only in December of 2022 was an advice note produced by the Department of Education to say, this is what you need to follow. I don't know why they didn't use the Institute of Structural Engineers guidance, and that note was very unclear, is a polite way of putting it. The concerns with the concrete are that you can have major issues with the embedded reinforcement that can corrode. And unlike conventional reinforcement in concrete, we spot cracking and spalling and such like.
Yeah.
So it gives us a bit of an indication of it may fall down. We don't get that with rack concrete. And therefore, that's why we need to do a phased approach, work out where it is in the school. And the only way you can definitively, and I say definitively because I'm concerned about some of the surveys that have been done, you need to actually break off a little bit of the concrete and inspect the internal part of it to actually confirm 100% it is rack. Once it is rack, one of the things that's been swept over is you then have to ascertain its condition. And based upon the condition, you can then pass that information over to a qualified structural engineer who can do a risk assessment. And in some instances, it could be as easy just to monitor the structure. Others, you may need some temporary propping or further investigation to work out where there are certain issues. And in the worst case scenario, you would need to remove and rebuild the roof. But it's not a yes, no, black, white answer. And I don't get the idea that many politicians understand that.
No, well, I'd say, Warren, it wasn't a yes, no, black or white answer, but it was a very, very full and comprehensive answer. It sounds to me like this stuff is past its sell-by date, and ultimately, over the next few years, it's all going to have to be replaced.
Well, what happens is we had an issue back in the 70s and 80s with another type of problematical concrete called high alumina cement. And that, if it was wetted and dried because of bad roofs and maintenance of the roofs, it could dramatically reduce its strength and fail. It's a similar activity with rack concrete. If it's kept dry and managed properly, it could survive for some time. But the problem is with a lot of the structures that we're talking about, Nigel, all you need to do is look at some of the bridge structures that were designed for a 50-year lifespan. They're now 55 years old, 56 years old, and we have the same issue. As long as we can maintain them and inspect them and test them, we don't have a problem. But we do that with highway structures, but unfortunately with structures such as schools, hospitals, courts, buildings in general, there is no formal testing, inspection.
No. Well, I think now, actually, Warren, there might be. Thank you for joining us and giving us that proper expert information. Thank you very much indeed. Christine Cunniff joins me, head teacher of the Licensed Victualler School in Ascot. 6 weeks the kids have been off. It's rained almost every day. They're supposed to go back to school. I pity the poor parents in these 104 schools. It sounds to me, from what Warren's saying, this could be affecting a very large number of schools.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite shocking, you know, the fact that it's announced literally before the children come back to school, and they've had enough disruption as it is. So I really feel for those head teachers who, once again, have had to think very quickly about how they're going to accommodate these children and their education.
Yeah, it's been rotten for the 18-year-olds that have just left, of course. They didn't get to sit GCSEs properly. They found their grades a lot tougher than the previous couple of years, and now we've got another year group beginning to suffer. Where do we apportion blame on this?
Well, I think, you know, just looking at, you know, post-war Britain and building, you look at the amount of governments there's probably not equal amount of Labour governments in, probably a bit more Conservatives, but they're all to blame because they were all party to this. They all knew that. Where was the risk assessments or a document that said this material only has a lifespan of 40 years and what we're going to do about it and what's the programme to rebuild and why all of a sudden has it come up a couple of days before the start of term and these children can't come to school?
As our engineer, as Warren said, in 1996, concerns were first raised about these structures, aimed at 50 years, and a lot of them are older than that. But as somebody that works, Christine, in the education sector, Gillian Keegan, our education secretary, didn't exactly cover herself in glory this morning, did she?
Well, do you know, that was the first time I saw it, because I've obviously been busy working in school today, and I actually might have heard my sharp intake of breath when I saw that, well, heard it here in the studio for the first time. You know, it's not about blame. I mean, what happened there was very unfortunate, and, you know, it should not have happened. But they can't apportion blame to any one person, and it's about time we stopped having education at the risk of political parties scoring points at each other. Because I've heard the dialogue between Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, and to be quite honest with you, I think this is not a time for scoring for an election. When these children are not in school, they need to get together, get their act together. Well, that's not going to happen, is it?
It never happens.
It's never going to happen. No. And all the time we have these political parties point scoring. Education will never improve in this country.
You may be right. You may be right, unless we get an election and we get a party with a completely new philosophy for education and radical reform of education, and that is possible. But is Gillian Keegan fit for purpose?
I think that was highly embarrassing, what happened today. I'm not going to say whether it's fit for purpose or not. I think, really, to be quite honest with you, we should stop this backbiting. We should stop throwing people under the bus and actually pull out...
She threw herself under the bus.
Well, she may well have done. Good, you know, she's fallen us right under the bus, hasn't she? But is this a time to actually be blaming people? And why can't we just spend the money and the time and the effort now getting these kids back into school in buildings that are fit for purpose? Because we do have the materials, we do have the land, we do have the manpower. So what's happening?
But to rebuild a huge number of schools that were built... And I said in the introduction, you know, this sort of post-war population boom was happening. By the middle, late 50s, we had to build a lot more schools to cope with this uptick in population. It's going to cost a fortune, isn't it?
Yeah, well, somewhere we've got to find the money from somewhere. Children should be the priority. They're our future. If we can't invest in them, what does it look like for the future?
Well, I think our children have had a pretty rotten time of it over the last couple of years. Christine, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Well, who's to blame? Who is to say? Now, tomorrow, the Commons will debate the new energy bill. There are something like 300 amendments that have been put down. And there was a big protest outside Parliament today, led by the BBC's Chris Packham. Now, he is an active environmental campaigner, some would say fanatic. In a moment, we talk to him about why he thinks there should be no more oil and gas and why we should cover the Palace of Westminster in solar panels. No, seriously, all of that in just a couple of minutes.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Well, with Parliament back as well, not just the schools, at least those that are opening. Tomorrow will be a big energy day. Yes, energy policy will be debated, many amendments put down. And of course, campaigners on both sides are urging MPs to act in one way or another. Well, GB News' Joe Casper went down to Parliament Square to interview Chris Packham. Now, he started off by asking him about his protest at Rishi Sunak giving new licences out for oil and gas drilling in the North Sea and the very concept of energy self-sufficiency.
Well, I've been helping to assemble a group of scientists to come here today. The scientists are the people with their fingers really firmly on the pulse of climate breakdown. They're the people with the facts. And what I want to happen is for MPs, our elected representatives and ministers, to come out of that building and listen to these people. Because the message is very clear. We need to leave fossil fuels in the ground if we are going to get through this period of climate breakdown. That's the first thing that we can do. And at the moment, we've got a government which isn't listening. It's already said that it's going to open another coal mine and also grant 100 new licences for oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. That's not a healthy way forward for you, for me, for wildlife and for the planet.
Arguably, though, Chris, that the government is listening to its voters who are being stung by energy bills, cost of living crisis, and maybe energy self-sufficiency is the way to go for this country.
So a recent poll shows us that second to the cost of living crisis, the thing that's worrying the British public most of all is climate breakdown. So it's high on the political agenda, and therefore it needs to be dealt with properly. And when this government says that it's going to offer us energy security by further exploitation of North Sea oil and gas, it's lying. That's not true. For instance, if it were to grant a drilling licence for Rosebank, that Rosebank oil field is owned by the Norwegian government. They would own that oil, not the UK. We would make some tax revenue for it. And ultimately, if we invest in new oil and gas, not that it's already being pumped at the moment, it could take 20 to 30 years before that comes online. And in 20 to 30 years' time, we're not going to be using oil and gas. What this government needs to see is that it needs to make a rapid transition of investment into renewable energies. And that means retraining, investing those communities that are currently engaged in the oil and gas industries to make sure that they have a secure future economically and we all have a secure future environmentally.
Well, there's the argument put, and it's put articulately and it's put with passion. I think it's nonsense, but that is what Packham and the others believe. They genuinely think that we will not be using oil and gas in 20 or 30 years' time. I think we will be using oil and gas, maybe less of it, but we will be using it in 20 or 30 years' time, and we'll be using a hell of a lot of it for at least the next 20 years. And I'd say, Chris, if you're really worried about fossil fuel emissions, you're in the wrong city. You should be in Beijing. That's where the protest should be, because, of course, the Chinese built 80 gigantic coal-fired power stations in 2022 alone. Now, Joe Casper went on to ask him about onshore wind farms, because it would seem that Rishi Sunak's government have had a complete change of heart. It looks like MPs tomorrow will approve the building, once again, of onshore wind farms.
I am. It's investment in renewables. The thing about onshore wind is we have to be very careful where we put it. It requires public consultation, and obviously, as a wildlife lover, we need to make sure we put it in a place where it doesn't damage our wildlife. But
I'm sorry, Chris, but a wildlife lover, wind farms kill lots of thousands of birds every single year.
When wind farms were initially put up, and we're talking a long time ago now, some of them were sited in the wrong place and they damaged migratory birds. There's no question about that. I've seen it. I can't deny that. But that's because it was early days. They were in the wrong place. We have the technology. We know where the birds are, and we need to work together to make sure that we and the birds have a sustainable future. And that means we've got to invest in those renewable energies.
Well, whether Chris Packham is right about the siting of those wind farms, I just don't know. All I would say is our plans are to pretty much fill up the North Sea with vast numbers of wind turbines. And, of course, we get this massive migration, which will start next month. Ducks, geese, swans coming across from Finland, Russia, many other parts of Scandinavia. I can't comment whether Packham is right about the siting of these wind farms. What I absolutely can say is that the more reliant we are on wind energy, the more vulnerable we are to total power blackouts. Unless, of course, we have the available gas to back it up so that we can literally keep the lights on. And this show has discussed this time and time again, but we're up against people who genuinely think that renewable energy is actually going to satisfy the needs of this country, when, frankly, it simply cannot do so. And finally, things that we can perhaps do at home, including this very entertaining suggestion by Chris Packham as to what we should do with the Palace of Westminster.
Well, I would say to them, speak to any landscape photographer and ask them what they think about pylons, all of those power cables which stretch and crisscross all across our country. They merge into the landscape. I lived near a system of pylons for a long time. They vanished from my day-to-day life. We soon begin to accept changes in our landscape, and this is a time where we have to change. We have to change our minds and our practices, because if we don't have a future for us or that landscape. There's no doubt about that. And when it comes to solar, what about the roof of that building? What about the roof of that building? What about the roof of the House of Commons? We could cover that with solar panels. And
you want to cover the House of Commons, Houses of Parliament, with solar panels?
That would be a lovely stunt, wouldn't it, really? But, I mean, speaking more sensibly, there were a lot of buildings here in London with flat roofs that could have solar on, and that would add to the energy efficiency of this city. So putting solar in the right place, putting wind in the right place would be the right thing to do. But we've got no choice but do it.
Well, there you are. Solar panels all over the Palace of Westminster. Who knows? It may well happen. And as for his We Love Pylons campaign, well, let me assure you that all the big new proposals for North Sea wind development will mean a very large number of pylons going across East Anglia, which is meeting, of course, with great local opposition. Who would want to live near those high-powered cables on the pylons? Absolutely nobody, I think sensibly suggest. And I have to say, it's quite funny, isn't it, really? that nearly everybody in Parliament is agreed about the need for us to go rapidly towards net zero, regardless of the fact that we only produce less than 1% of the world's CO2, and that India and China and Indonesia and others are frankly completely and utterly ignoring it. And it isn't just the over-reliance on wind. Actually, without subsidy, these projects would never have got off the ground. And once again, wind energy is pretty marginal because of the increased cost of the turbines and everything else. The only way it'll survive is with big taxpayer-funded subsidy. Of that, I'm as near certain as I can be. But it's funny, you've got a pro-net zero Parliament, you've got campaigners outside saying go further, go quicker, and actually, public opinion is saying, look, yeah, sure, we all want to live in a decent environment, but the realisation of how relatively small the UK is, how little difference, frankly, we make on the world, and the sheer cost to everybody of policies that frankly are mad, and I would include ULEZ in this. I mean, ULEZ is part of Khan's determination to push for net zero. And all of this simply makes the poor poorer. Meanwhile, there are those living off council taxpayers and taxpayers' money, working for local councils, increasingly well paid, and some very, very good work, and we're going to show you in a moment the research that's come out from a Taxpayers Alliance showing hundreds, thousands of people being well paid, working for local councils, not just working from home, not just working from the beach, but literally working from abroad. Surely, council taxpayers deserve better than this. And in a moment, I'll tell you what Sadiq Khan has had to say about me over the course of the last couple of days.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes, and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio, and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Well, so many stories over the years, they seem to get worse, about people who work on taxpayers' or council taxpayers' money. Well, this one really is a bit of a bombshell. I'm joined by Connor Holohan of the Taxpayers Alliance, Media Campaign Manager. This stuff he produces, Connor, is extraordinary. We know work from home. We know... Well, in fact, in Scotland, Humza Yousaf is now proposing just a 4-day week for public sector workers, and we know that, 3-day weeks have become common. I mean, to be fair, in parts of the private sector too, although that's going to change, believe you me. But what you've uncovered here is astonishing. It's not just working from home. It's not just taking a mobile phone call on Bournemouth Beach. It's working from abroad, and in some cases for large periods of time. Give us a couple of examples of what you've found.
So across the board, we've found 1,300 examples of where council staff have been given the sign-off to go and work from abroad, and we've seen this in places, closer places like France and Spain, but further afield like Brazil and South Africa and the USA and things like that.
And they're working for the local council.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, there are some examples like Barnet, which is the most egregious, where there are just under 300 instances of people being signed off to go and work from abroad. I think local people are thinking, well, if you're not, feeling the potholes under your car and you're not in the local area, feeling the issues that matter there, how are you going to properly do the job?
Now, it could be argued, maybe they're just going for a fortnight's holiday and in theory working whilst they're on holiday, which, if there's a big emergency that you're involved in, can be possible. So are they going to work abroad for long periods of time? That's the key.
Absolutely. And in Croydon's case, they had one staff member who was signed off to work for 800 days abroad. I think in some instances, like you say...
Hang on, that's about 4 years
Absolutely,
work.
Absolutely. So essentially a permanent sign-off to go and work on other shores. And I think, like you say, if there's a bereavement or someone needs to go abroad for treatment, there's got to be some sort of flexibility there. But I think it's different when it's for such a long period of time. And what we've seen is, since 2020, a tenfold increase in the instances of people being signed off to go and work from abroad.
Since 2020, a tenfold increase. So once again, something that was put in train during the pandemic that has not been fully reversed.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, again, the 4-day week and work from home. We see services aren't getting any better. And in terms of work from home or working abroad, we see yesterday in the Mail on Sunday that HMRC, the amount of calls they're not picking up has doubled over the last 5 years. So we can see that services aren't being maintained. Offices which council taxpayers are paying for are empty, and the staff are elsewhere sunning themselves.
Well, if I was a council taxpayer in Croydon, I'd be very upset that somebody had worked abroad for 4 years, given the state of the council's fight. It's basically bust. They haven't submitted accounts this year. Who holds these people to account? I mean, we can argue at elections as they come round, and in the case of these two particular areas that you've mentioned, there'll be assembly elections for the London Assembly next year, not directly but indirectly relevant to these areas. But I mean, who disciplines councils?
Well, it's very difficult. So we saw with the 4-day week in South Cambridgeshire, there's a trial going on there and outcomes have dropped. And the local government minister, Lee Rowley, said to them, you've got to stop doing this trial. It's not good value for council taxpayers. And they just push on regardless because the government can't force them to change their working patterns. So unfortunately, it's got to be the ballot box, and that's the best we can do.
Yeah, I have to say, I think council taxpayers have a right to be pretty blooming angry about this. Now, Barnet have answered the Taxpayers Alliance, and I'll let you listen to what they have to say. Spokesman said, most of our staff who have permission to access systems from abroad are doing so while they're on holiday, ensuring that, in case of emergency, they are contactable and can deliver services for residents. Where the remainder have been given permission to work abroad, this is generally in response to specific situations, usually due to exceptional and/or family circumstances. We currently have 20 permissions for remote working, a spokesman has said. Well, that's their answer, and I do get it in the case of, an emergency or somebody being on call, but I think what you've uncovered here is clearly something that is very, very much bigger than that. Final thought before you go. It would appear that this government is engaged in quite a battle with the blob. I thought it was very interesting that the former permanent secretary, you know, at the Department for Education, who only retired in 2020, went on the Today programme this morning to say it's Rishi Sunak. He's the man that didn't rebuild these school buildings. What's the code of conduct there?
Absolutely. I mean, it's shocking. And, you know, of course, people should have their freedom of speech, but we see civil servants often taking shots at ministers. I mean, look what happened to Dominic Raab in terms of how he was turfed out following the sort of quote-unquote bullying scandal. So, you know, I think politicians, they want to get people back to their desks. They want to get the best out of people. And often the civil servants turn around when they don't like it.
No, they don't. Great stuff, Connor. Really good story. I'm sure many of our people busy paying their council tax will not be particularly happy with it, but that's where it is. Thank you. Great work.
Thank you, mate.
Now, Sadiq Khan, I suppose at some point he was going to hit back, wasn't he? And of course I've been immensely critical of the ULEZ expansion. It'll make no difference to air quality. All we're doing, frankly, is just taxing the poor, taxing some who are self-employed, acting as sole traders, pensioners who can't afford new cars, youngsters who can't afford ULEZ-compliant cars, all for very little benefit at all. But I'd also said that I couldn't see why he was organising what I see as divisive events, like a Black Day that took place last weekend in Trafalgar Square. Better, I would have suggested, to treat everybody equally. Well, the mayor has hit back and has said, listen, if Nigel Farage thinks it's a bad idea, by definition, it's got to be a good thing. I'm horribly divisive. Apparently. Well, no, it's Khan that's horribly divisive. And it's all well and good to talk about celebrating diversity, but hey, the weekend before, there was a massive festival that took place at Notting Hill. And Mayor Khan, I'll try and tease you back to the fight if I can. What about we hire Trafalgar Square next year for a 2 or 3 day extravaganza for the white people of London? Or would you say they're just not proper Londoners? I do wonder. On Saturday, lovely weather, 872 crossed the English Channel. And whilst it is true that given the 800 million quid that has been given and pledged by the British government to France, they are intercepting more boats on their beaches. They're taking off from a wider and wider stretch of French coast. Boats that launched this morning from Burke. Have a look at a map. That's now a long way west. There's no sign of any of this ending, and having had a look at the long-range forecast from Wednesday of this week until Monday of next week, it is going to be as flat as a pancake, and you can expect well in excess of 4 figures to come over that period of time. No sign of it ending whatsoever. Now, let's talk in a minute low emissions. Let's talk Glasgow, because they've brought in a form of LEZ that is far more extreme than ULEZ. In fact, it basically prohibits old cars from even entering the city. Isn't it funny? People talk about inclusion, but now want to exclude those that can't afford expensive cars. But it's had no benefit for emissions at all. In fact, things are worse. Glasgow's emissions scheme in just a moment.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Ray Addison here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
There were some that said that on GB News we'd overdone the ULEZ extension story. Why talk so much about the edges of Greater London? Yes, sure, huge population living in the southeast. And the point I kept making was no, actually, emission zones, congestion charges have come in. You know, Bristol's done it, Bath has done it, Birmingham has done it, and of course Glasgow has done it too. The difference is, if you think that the ULEZ extension is penal because we're charging pensioners £12.50 to go and see their GP, well, that's as nothing to what they've done in Glasgow. If your car doesn't qualify in Glasgow and you go into the city, it's 60 quid immediately. And if you repeat offend, it can be up to £480. So basically, if you're poor or old, you're now excluded by car from the city of Glasgow. I find this absolutely extraordinary from politicians who endlessly talk about inclusion. But what about the environmental impact? Now, whilst the LES scheme has not been fully in for that long, and I'll grant you that, but actually, some emissions, nitrous oxide, for example, has actually risen by 10%, which kind of indicates that maybe this has far more to do with lorries and buses, and actually what's happening atmospherically than it does to do with motor cars. It looks like a right old mess to me. Well, joining me is Neil Harvey, MP for the Alba Party for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath. Neil, do you take my point? In common with the ULEZ extension in London and what's happening in Glasgow, you're kind of saying to people, who live outside cities, who perhaps don't have much access to public transport, they're living in semi-rural areas. If you're poor, please don't come here. If you've got a big job and lots of money and a nice new car, we welcome you. How fair is this?
Oh, you've hit the nail on the head, really, and that is one of the deep frustrations of the situation in Glasgow. If you're going to introduce a new scheme, a project or whatever, whilst you have that clear objective in mind, it's really important to consider all of the adjacencies and consequential impacts that such a scheme might have, and to have some plan in place to make sure that those impacts are managed in an equitable way. And what we have in Glasgow is quite the opposite of that. We've got an ideologically driven scheme that has been forced on the city. It has driven very important charities, such as those who provide food to vulnerable and homeless
homeless people overnight out of the city because their vehicles cannot be adapted to enter the city. These are charities that haven't got a huge bank balance to run off and buy a new fleet of electric vehicles. So it's not just those examples, but you're right. It is ordinary working people who are now excluded from the centre of their own city, and it's not just to do with work. It's also if you go out socialising in the evening with buses and train services terminating earlier than the time people will come out of clubs. People are having to walk extended periods out of the city to go to parked cars, or you'll find young women walking alone at night on more deserted streets. It doesn't make any sense. And even the council themselves have had to spend over £100,000 replacing vehicles in their own fleet, hiring vehicles to cover their own fleet, because they weren't ready for this scheme. The fundamental problem with Glasgow is it's absolutist in its nature. It takes no prisoners and it has no flexibility.
And it would appear environmentally, by some measures, things are no better, if not slightly worse.
Yeah. I mean, I think there probably is a bedding-in period, so there will hopefully be some improvement in due course. And it's important to reflect that this is quite early days. But that doesn't vitiate the impact that this has had on some of the most vulnerable people in our society, the homeless people in the centre of Glasgow, and hard-working people who can barely afford to run a car, never mind replace it with a fancy new electric vehicle.
So interesting. Very similar arguments, I think, to the ones that we're seeing in the rural outskirts of London, although in this case even more extreme.
Exactly, because it's 24 hours a day as well. There is no time off on this scheme. It is in constantly in place.
And it's 60 quid. It's brutal. Neil Hanby, MP, thank you for joining me. Well, joining me down the line is Austin Sheridan, former SNP Glasgow City Councillor. And Austin, you know, I understand that you were very much in favour of going in this direction with the low emission zone. But do you take this point that it does actually socially exclude those who in many cases are at the lower income scale in society?
Well, what I would say, Nigel, is absolutely we need to make sure that the city centre belongs to everyone, not just those, you know, who can afford new cars. In terms of the scheme, although I am supportive of it, it has to be married up with some real investment in infrastructure, in particular transport. I mean, Glasgow has the largest suburban rail network outside London. We've got our Glasgow subway, which is due to get new rolling stock this year, and then there's projections over the next 30 years to be investing in a new Glasgow metro system to connect 1.5 million people. So really, I think it's focusing on that to make sure that people can access the city centre in an affordable way. What I do understand is that from a council perspective, what I've seen, I'm no longer a councillor, but from what I've seen how councillors are dealing with the city centre now is they are wanting to generally reduce cars getting into the city centre, period.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the point is, you know, there are people living outside Glasgow, you know, living in areas without good public transport links, perhaps slightly infirm, slightly elderly, who need their car to get close to, perhaps it's an important medical appointment, or perhaps it's a funeral to go to, or whatever it is. I mean, to think that those people with non-compliant cars are going to be charged 60 quid. I mean, where's the equity in that?
So anyone who's a blue badge holder, Nigel, they're exempt from the scheme. So anyone who does rely on their vehicle for mobility, etc., will be able to access the city centre. So there are flexibilities. Also, looking at some, you know, with any scheme, Nigel, I think it would be wrong to say that these things shouldn't be reviewed. I know that there are some instances, you know, maybe some sectors where they do have to maybe look at some other exemptions in order to make sure that services can be delivered. Absolutely, of course, we should be flexible. And when we come across, but we should say common sense, Nigel, right? If there's a common sense you know, exclusion from the scheme, then the council should, of course, be open to that, and they should grant that common sense. You know, exemption. But the problem is, Nigel, as you know,
you are creating
political, but there's a lot of common sense doesn't prevail in politics.
You are creating a huge amount of bureaucracy. I put it to you that if we were really worried about emissions rather than worrying about the age of motor cars, we look at the annual MOT test, and if a car passes the emissions test, it doesn't matter how old it is.
Yeah, Nigel, as I say, that would be something that I would be open to looking at. But I think fundamentally, it's investment in our transport infrastructure. I mean, to introduce these schemes is all good and well, but it has to be married up with proper investment. And the problem is with some of these things that they get put in place, but we can't use that as a way to let politicians off the hook in terms of providing proper investment in our transport infrastructure. And for me personally, Nigel, that's what we should focus more on, so that it becomes logical to take public transport in our sector anyway, and there wouldn't be a great desire to take your car and to the centre of the city. And so if we invest in transport infrastructure, I think that will go a long way to helping people.
Well, it may well, but I promise you, you'll never be able to move everybody around by public transport. But I thank you very much indeed, Austin, for joining me on the programme this evening. Thank you. Now, we're back into the season of Farage at Larges as we go around the country and do our live shows with you, the live audience. And they're great fun, they're very revealing, and we really do get some huge passion on local issues. Interesting how wherever we go, there are local issues, but they're national issues as well. Because it doesn't matter where we live in this country, very often it's the similar things that we're talking about and debating. Now, our next meeting, our next event is going to be in the county of Essex, in Witham. Yes, that constituency in northern Essex, where, of course, the Member of Parliament is the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel. And what I can tell you is that Priti Patel will be appearing live on that programme. Now, all of that's great stuff. There is but one problem. Tickets for this are going to go very, very quickly. I guarantee you we will be absolutely full with a waiting list by breakfast time tomorrow. If you want to come along and join us, myself, Priti Patel, a studio audience, live TV, come and ask your questions. If you want to come to Witham this month, go to gbnews.com. The dates, the details, the times will all be there. If you want to come, you jolly well better get online. I would say, like, kind of now might be really, really useful. OK, I'm joined in the studio by Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, I'm very disturbed about this energy bill being put forward tomorrow and some of the amendments that would almost criminalise us for not getting our own private houses up to a certain standard.
Oh, it's an absolutely monstrous bill. In my brief period as Energy Secretary, I was trying to at least defang it, if not get rid of it altogether. It's going to put huge costs on the British taxpayer, £20 billion for carbon capture and storage. And that's before you get on to the extra charges through energy efficiency, homemaking, and rules and regulations may make it hard for you to sell your house. Smart meters, continuing with those, which ultimately will see people have higher prices.
I hate them.
It's all about high cost. When we're in a cost of living crisis, I put forward an amendment to propose that low-cost energy should be the priority.
And you'll be speaking tomorrow?
I'll speak tomorrow.
Yeah, what a blooming good thing too. Jacob, with you in just a moment. The weather, it's wonderful. Of course it is. The kids have gone back to school. I bet you this forecast is superb.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good evening. As we head into Tuesday, there will be a little bit of fog around tonight. Whilst in the southwest, we can expect some strong blustery winds, but the hot and sunny weather returns as we go through tomorrow because of this air of high pressure dominating the picture across the UK, leading to largely settled weather and dragging hot air in from the south. Meanwhile, looking at the details through Monday night, there is a front across the far north of Scotland, bringing some cloud and rain to Shetland. Elsewhere, a largely dry picture, clear skies, but some mist and fog patches developing, particularly towards the north and the east. Windier in the southwest, but many places seeing temperatures not dropping a huge amount, generally staying the mid to high teens Celsius, so quite a warm night to come. Bright start on Tuesday morning. Any mist and fog should quickly clear away. And then we do have that front I mentioned earlier gradually pushing its way further southwards, so turning a bit cloudy, a bit damp perhaps for Orkney in the far north of mainland Scotland. Elsewhere across the UK, lots of fine sunny weather, plenty of blue skies, and temperatures could be a touch higher than today for some, so highs around 31 Celsius, staying quite windy towards the southwest though. Wednesday's going to get off to a bit of a murky start for some eastern northeastern parts with some har and sea fret around. Most of that will burn back towards the coast, though the cloud could linger across the far east of Scotland. Otherwise, though, yes, it'll be a touch cloudier than recent days, but plenty of sunshine to be had. And with that, temperatures rising, likely to peak around Wednesday or Thursday, though the risk of some showers.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The government's overly zealous net zero-driven energy bill is to be debated for its third and final reading tomorrow evening, but it ought to be scrapped. At a time of a cost of living crisis, the priority should be reducing the cost of energy. I tabled an amendment stating exactly this, but the government so far has ignored it, so I will not be supporting the bill tomorrow. As the private sector tells its staff to get back to the office, the public sector is lagging, working from the beach. Over the past 3 years, town hall bosses have granted nearly 1,500 requests for overseas work. So while you're going back to the office, taking your work seriously, paying taxes, some of which, your council taxes, are funding extended holidays, masquerading as remote work. On State of the Nation tonight, I'll be hosting our very own competition for incompetent councils in Britain. We'll be taking your nominations throughout the programme. We'll also be playing a game of Spot the Conservative. On the left, you can see a picture of the Leader of the Opposition.